I'm a cemetery operations coordinator, or, more simply, a cemetery manager. It's not the kind of job a kid ever dreams about, but after 15 years in the role, I've grown accustomed to the quiet dignity of it all. My work revolves around guiding families through the hardest days of their lives, setting up funerals, arranging plots, handling the endless paperwork. The details of death that shouldn't be on a grieving family's shoulders often fall onto mine. It was early March when I first met Antonio. He was in his early 30s, a Hispanic man with a thick accent that made you lean closer just to catch every word. But it wasn't his voice that stayed with me. It was his eyes. In this line of work, you start to recognize the difference between fresh grief and the kind of sorrow that knows it's only days away. Antonio carried the latter. His gaze seemed to hold both love and dread, as though he was already standing halfway in mourning. From the first conversation, I could tell he was a deeply spiritual man. A small silver cross hung around his neck, and as he spoke, his fingers brushed against it unconsciously, almost like a lifeline. That Tuesday afternoon, Antonio came to purchase a plot for his father, who was in hospice care. His voice faltered only once, when he admitted the doctors had given his father less than a week. He didn't want his family to worry about arrangements after the inevitable. He showed me photos on his phone, his father surrounded by grandchildren, tending to a small backyard garden, smiling gently at family gatherings. The man couldn't have been older than 70, his face worn by years of work but softened by kindness. Too young to be leaving, too loved to let go so soon. Antonio chose a plot under a cluster of oak trees, a place where the morning sunlight cut through the branches. His father, he said, had always risen early to sit on the porch with his coffee and greet the dawn. That spot felt right. By Thursday, Antonio's voice reached me again, this time over the phone. It was flatter, more distant, as though grief itself was speaking. His father had passed. The funeral was set for Monday. That weekend, I checked the forecast and frowned at the storm system moving in. March storms can be relentless, and outdoor services become a battle with the elements. I gently raised my concerns, but Antonio refused to shift the date. Papa wouldn't want us to wait, he said simply. The day of the funeral came cloaked in heavy skies. Clouds pressed low, dark and swollen, and the wind carried that sharp edge that promised something more than rain. In some traditions, rain at a funeral is seen as a blessing for the dead. I've heard families find comfort in that belief. Still, there was something about the atmosphere that afternoon that felt less like blessing and more like warning. At 2 p.m., the procession arrived. I stepped out under the office awning, jacket pulled tight against the gusts, and spotted Antonio in the second car behind the hearse. His dark suit seemed a size too large for him, as though it belonged to someone older. When our eyes met, we exchanged a brief wave, small, but meaningful. An unspoken acknowledgement between two people connected by the weight of what was coming. As the wind howled louder, I ducked back inside for my heavy-duty umbrella, rain boots, and a thermos of coffee. Experience had taught me to be ready for whatever nature throws at us, and that day felt like it was preparing to test everyone. I also tucked a box of tissues under my arm. Little gestures matter when families are at their most fragile. I followed the procession in one of the cemetery pickup trucks to the chosen site beneath the oaks. My role at funerals is quiet but essential. Stand at the edges, umbrella in hand, and make sure nothing interferes with the dignity of the service. Yet that day, even as I focused on logistics, I couldn't shake the strange heaviness in the air. Despite the weather, the service was beautiful. Around 30 relatives gathered, elders hunched against the rain, children clutching at their parents. The priest alternated between Spanish and English, his voice rising and falling against the storm's backdrop. Antonio stood motionless throughout, rain streaming down his face as if he couldn't, or wouldn't, wipe it away. His hand rested protectively on his young son's shoulder. The boy, no older than 8, kept looking up with wide, bewildered eyes, as though searching for answers in his father's silence. When the last prayer was said, I performed my usual routine, circling the grounds in the truck to check for fallen branches and rising water. The storm was worsening quickly. It was practical work, necessary work, but as I drove the winding lanes of the cemetery, I felt the unsettling certainty that this funeral was not the end of Antonio's story here. Something about the way he stood in that storm, unflinching, eyes locked on the grave even as the rain drowned him, it lingered. And in this job, when something lingers like that, it rarely lets go quietly. We have a drainage system, but the truth is, old cemeteries were never built for the kind of heavy downpours we've been getting lately. Water finds its way into every dip, every corner, and in storms like this, the ground itself feels restless. That Monday, the rain was steady, and I had plenty to keep me inside. My desk was buried under stacks of documents, death certificates waiting to be filed, plot transfers, invoices from the florist and the monument company. It never stops amazing me how much paperwork circles around death. Every form, every signature, tied to someone's final chapter. If you let yourself think too long about the weight of it, it'll crush you. So you learn to keep a professional distance, though some days it feels thinner than others. Normally, closing the cemetery wasn't my job. Maria, our evening groundskeeper, usually handled it. But she'd called in sick with the flu that was sweeping through town, which meant the responsibility fell to me. I didn't think much of it at first, just an inconvenience, staying later than I wanted, but looking back now, I wonder if her absence wasn't just chance. By the time I glanced at the clock again, it was after 5 o'clock. The cemetery closes at 5:30, but the storm and the early spring sunset had dragged night down fast. Between the low clouds and the sheets of rain, visibility was poor, like the place had slipped into darkness an hour too soon. I grabbed the keys, pulled on my rain gear, and started my rounds. The drive was routine at first, headlights sweeping across rows of headstones, raindrops racing down the windshield. I didn't see anyone until I was almost done, just before heading to lock the front gate. Out of the corner of my eye, something moved. A figure, dark and hurried, cutting between tombstones before slipping behind a hedge and vanishing from sight. At first, I thought maybe the storm was playing tricks on me. The wipers struggled against the downpour, and the glass was smeared with streaks of water, but no, there had been movement. A person. My gut knew it. I gave 2 sharp taps of the horn, our usual way of letting late visitors know it was time to leave. No response. Most people wave or start heading toward the road. This one didn't. It was as though they had melted into the cemetery itself. I pulled over, annoyed but uneasy, grabbed my umbrella, and stepped into the storm. The wind shoved against me as I made my way toward the hedge where I'd last seen the figure. Beyond it stretched a long lane of tombstones, the kind that narrow into darkness when the light fades. To my right was the section where Antonio's father had been buried earlier that very day. His grave stood out easily, fresh dirt, bright flowers not yet beaten down by the storm. But no sign of anyone. "Hello." I called into the rain. My voice came back to me thin and distorted. Cemeteries closed. Nothing. Just the sound of water drumming against leaves and stone. I searched for 10 minutes, ducking behind monuments, circling trees, scanning every shadowed corner. My umbrella buckled against the wind, and cold water soaked through my clothes. Whoever I'd seen, they were either gone or hiding in a way that didn't make sense. People visiting graves after hours usually don't vanish without a trace. Finally, shivering and frustrated, I gave up. I told myself I'd check the perimeter in the morning for signs of the fence being tampered with. Sometimes people climb over instead of using the gate. That seemed like a good enough explanation, at least one I could live with for the night. I drove back to the office, dripping water across the tile floor as I peeled off my jacket. Still unsettled, I went straight to the CCTV system. 6 cameras cover the grounds, though not all angles. Budget cuts have left more blind spots than I like. I rewound to about half an hour earlier, scanning through the footage. The rain distorted the picture, static lines rolling across the screen. The storm made the cameras nearly useless. Everything looked blurred, shrouded, half-formed. No movement. Nothing. If there had been someone walking the grounds, at least one lens should have caught them. But the feed stayed stubbornly empty. I left them running in the corner of my vision as I tried to finish up paperwork, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something, that somewhere in the static, the storm had hidden more than rain. The office was silent except for the tapping of water against the windows and the distant growl of thunder. And yet, every few minutes, I caught myself glancing back at the monitors. Because sometimes, in a place like this, silence isn't comfort. It's warning. I was just starting to think about packing up and heading home when it happened, the sound that would shatter the quiet of the office and make my skin crawl. The heavy front door to the visitation room slammed shut with a sharp crack echoing down the hallway like a gunshot. For a second, my heart stopped. I shot up from my chair, papers spilling to the floor, and yelled, "Hello!" The sound had been unmistakable. Not the wind, not a creak. It was the door. And not just any door. The thick wooden one in the visitation room, the one with that signature thud you couldn't mistake even on the busiest day. It was a door meant to keep noise out, which made the slam all the more unnerving. My first thought was immediate and logical, the figure I'd seen earlier in the cemetery. Maybe they'd gotten locked in after I secured the main gate and were now trying to get my attention. But deep down, something else stirred, something I didn't want to name yet. I stepped out into the lobby, my footsteps echoing on the polished floor. The soft light from the desk lamp threw long, spidery shadows across the room, making the chairs along the walls look like figures hunched in grief. "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded small against the emptiness. "The cemetery's closed, but I can help you get out." Silence. The lobby was completely empty. Everything was exactly as I'd left it: the neat chairs, the empty reception desk, the lamp casting its long glow. Only the shadows had changed, stretching deeper now, reaching toward me like fingers. I said, "Hello," again, louder this time. My own voice startled me. Maybe the door slam had been someone leaving rather than entering, but even that didn't make sense. The gates were locked. No one should have been here. I moved to the windows, peering through each one. Outside, the storm raged harder, hammering the glass with sheets of rain. Darkness and water combined to make the world beyond look almost fluid, like a painting melting in real time. I pressed my face close, cupping my hands around my eyes to block the interior light. When I reached the window facing the east side of the cemetery, I froze. There, on the other side of the glass, someone was looking back at me. At first, it was just a silhouette against the gray smear of storm clouds. But as my eyes adjusted, details emerged. A man, perfectly still despite the rain pouring down around him. Dark jacket or sweater. Gray or white hair plastered to his forehead. And the expression, or lack of it. He stared at me with a face like stone. No recognition. No surprise. No life. I stumbled back, a scream tearing out of me before I could stop it. The sound seemed to vanish into the room, swallowed by the storm's howl. He didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just stood there, blank and watching. I crept back toward the window, squinting through the streaked glass. The harder I looked, the more my stomach turned. I knew that face. The gray hair. The jawline. The posture. It was exactly like the photos Antonio had shown me of his father just a week earlier. But that was impossible. I had been there when Antonio's father was lowered into the ground earlier that same day. I had supervised the funeral myself, the image of the casket still fresh in my mind. And yet, here he was. I bolted. Out the front door, around to the side of the building, rain soaking through my shirt in seconds. The wind was strong enough to shove me sideways as I rounded the corner, but I didn't care. He had to be there. He had to be. But he wasn't. No figure standing in the rain. No man walking across the field. No one hiding behind the trees. Just empty space and the steady hiss of rain. The ground was soft from the downpour, yet no footprints marked where someone had stood. Nothing but a patch of grass slick with water, as if I'd imagined the whole thing. I spun in circles, scanning every shadow. The rational part of my mind was shouting explanations. A reflection, a trick of the light, exhaustion. But another part of me, the part that had seen hundreds of grieving families, knew better. I knew what I'd seen. And I knew who it was. I ran back inside, dripping water onto the floor, hands shaking as I shoved papers into my bag. I didn't care about the remaining paperwork or the security checks. I just wanted out. Out of the building, out of the cemetery, out of the possibility that dead men could stand in the rain and stare at you with blank eyes. I locked the office and jumped into my car, driving to the front gate. Even as I opened it, drove through, and climbed back out to lock it behind me, my eyes kept flicking toward the tombstones. Some foolish, terrified part of me expected to see him again, standing in the rows, waiting, watching. The drive home normally takes 15 minutes, but that night it stretched like hours. Every shadow by the roadside looked like a figure. Every swaying branch looked like a hand waving me down. My rearview mirror became an obsession. I kept checking, half expecting that blank face to appear in the back seat. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house felt like another world. Warm, bright, alive. My wife, Linda, was in the kitchen making dinner. She turned at the sound of the door, took one look at me, pale, soaked eyes wide, and asked, "Are you okay?" I tried to smile. "Long day at work," I said, my voice thin. Linda raised an eyebrow. "And you're soaked. Don't tell me you forgot your umbrella again." How could I explain it? How could I tell her that I had looked into the face of a man I'd buried hours earlier? That I had felt that instant of recognition, the bone-deep certainty of seeing someone who shouldn't be there? Linda's used to my stories about funerals and grieving families. She's heard about people collapsing at gravesides, about the emotional toll of death. But this was different. She seemed to sense it too, though she didn't press. She just made sure I had a hot shower and a warm dinner. And as I sat at the table, trying to act normal, one thought echoed louder than the storm ever had. If he was out there tonight, staring at me through the glass, what was going to stop him from coming back? That night, I lay in bed listening to the storm pound against the windows, the thunder rolling like a warning I couldn't quite decipher. Sleep wouldn't come. My mind kept circling back to the man outside the window, replaying every detail I'd tried so hard to dismiss. The longer I thought about it, the stranger it became. Why hadn't he been wet? The rain had been pouring down hard enough to drench me in seconds, but his hair and clothes had looked perfectly dry, almost untouched, as though the storm itself refused to touch him. And those eyes. They hadn't just been blank, they'd been fixed on me, unblinking, as if he were trying to communicate something specific. Like he wanted to say something but couldn't cross whatever divide stood between us. But the detail that chilled me most didn't even register until later. When I had run outside to find him, I'd stood in the exact spot where he'd been, yet the ground there had been completely dry. Not damp, not less wet than the surrounding area, completely dry, as though something invisible had been shielding that patch of earth. I tried to tell myself I was overthinking it, that stress and exhaustion were twisting my memories into something impossible. But deep down, under all the rationalizing, I knew it had been real. The only question was what exactly I had seen, a living person or something else entirely. The next morning, I arrived at work early and went straight to the east side of the building where I'd seen the figure. In daylight, with the storm past, everything looked painfully ordinary. The ground was evenly wet from the night's rain, no mysterious dry patches. Yet as I stood there, scanning the area, a fresh dread crept up my spine. There were no footprints. Not faint marks washed away by the rain, no indentations at all in the soft, soaked earth. It was as if whoever, or whatever, I'd seen had simply materialized there without walking from anywhere else. For the rest of that week, I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination. Stress-induced, they call it. The mind's trick for coping with emotional overload. I'd supervised hundreds of funerals, but something about Antonio's story, the loving son preparing for his father's death, the storm, the intimate family gathering, had gotten under my skin in a way I couldn't shake. Then Monday came. Antonio stopped by to finalize paperwork and pay the last invoice. He looked like he was trying to heal, to piece himself back together after his father's passing. We were sitting in my office going over the final details when he said something that made my hands start to tremble. "You know," he said, glancing out the window toward his father's grave, "the strangest thing happened last night. I was having trouble sleeping, thinking about Papa, and I could have sworn I saw him standing in our backyard, looking up at my bedroom window. Just for a second, but it felt so real." My mouth went dry. "What time?" I asked. "About 2 a.m., he said. right when the storm was at its worst. I know it sounds crazy, but he looked exactly like he did in life. Except, Antonio paused, struggling to find words. Except what? I prompted. Except he wasn't getting wet from the rain. And when I blinked and looked again, he was gone. The similarities to my own experience were too exact to dismiss. Antonio's father, dry in the rain, appearing and disappearing without explanation, seen by two different people on the same stormy night. Either we had both suffered the same stress-induced hallucination, or something else was happening. I never told Antonio what I had seen. What good would it have done? But his words confirmed what I had been trying so hard to deny, that what we'd both experienced wasn't just grief playing tricks on our minds. Over the next few months, I began paying closer attention to the cemetery. I talked to other employees, combed through incident reports, even spoke with regular visitors who'd been coming for years. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Sightings of deceased individuals weren't as uncommon as I had thought. They almost always occurred during or shortly after storms. They typically involved people who'd been recently buried. And witnesses consistently reported the same eerie detail. The figures appeared completely untouched by weather conditions. But there was something about Antonio's father that made him stand out. According to our records, most sightings lasted only a few seconds and never repeated. Yet Antonio's father continued to be seen regularly for nearly 3 months after his burial. Maria, our evening groundskeeper, told me she'd seen him several times during her late shifts. Always in the same area, she said quietly. Near his grave, sometimes near the office. He never seems threatening, just present, like he's watching over things. James, one of our other groundskeepers, reported similar sightings. Always during overcast or stormy weather. Always the same figure standing motionless in the rain without getting wet. Other visitors didn't always see him but described the sensation of being watched in that section of the cemetery, a heavy presence lingering just out of sight. Gradually, the sightings decreased. By late spring, they stopped altogether. The last report came from an elderly woman who visited her husband's grave every Tuesday. She said she'd seen Antonio's father standing near his headstone, but this time he'd looked peaceful rather than watchful, and had slowly faded away instead of vanishing instantly. I never saw him again after that first night. Still, on stormy evenings, I find myself glancing toward that east-facing window, half expecting to see his silhouette standing there again. Part of me feels relief that the encounter stopped. Another part wonders if there was unfinished business I never understood. To this day, I'm not sure what to make of it. The rational part of my mind insists it was stress, grief, suggestion. The emotional part of me knows some connections between the living and the dead are too strong to sever completely. What unsettles me most isn't whether it was real or imagined. It's the possibility that it was real, and that I failed to understand what Antonio's father was trying to communicate. Maybe he was checking on his family. Maybe he had something important to say. Maybe he wasn't ready to leave. Or maybe, and this is the thought that still keeps me awake on stormy nights, he was trying to warn us about something I'm still too blind to see. Maybe there are messages being sent from whatever lies beyond death, and we're all too frightened or too rational to hear them. I still work at the cemetery, still guide families through their darkest hours, still lock up alone on stormy nights. But now, I pay attention to things I once dismissed, shadows that move without cause, figures that stand too still, places where the rain doesn't dare to fall. There are nights when the quiet feels heavier than usual, when the air itself seems to hum with something unseen. Sounds echo across the cemetery that have no obvious source. A faint shuffle on gravel where no one stands, a low sigh carried by the wind that seems to come from nowhere. And then there's that feeling, the unmistakable sense of being watched, of eyes on you even when the grounds are empty. At first, I tried to dismiss it all as nerves or imagination. But after what I experienced with Antonio's father, I've stopped brushing those moments aside. Because if he could find a way to return, even briefly, to the world he'd left behind, what else might be possible? What other boundaries might not be as final as we tell ourselves? Maybe death isn't the clean break we're taught to believe it is. Maybe love, duty, and unfinished business can stretch across that invisible border between life and whatever waits on the other side. And maybe, on nights when the storm clouds roll in and the rain starts falling hard enough to blur reality, those we've buried slip back through, if only for a moment, to make sure we're still okay. To stand where they once stood, to watch over us the way we once watched over them. I'll never be entirely sure what I saw that night. But I know it shifted something deep inside me, something fundamental about how I understand my work, my responsibilities, and the razor-thin line separating the living from the dead. Sometimes, when I'm locking up after a long day and the sky is dark enough to swallow the horizon, I pause. I whisper a soft goodnight to the empty headstones, just in case someone is still out there, listening. And on some nights, especially when the wind picks up and the shadows stretch longer than they should, I swear I can feel them listening back.